when you see these works, they have an emotional quality. They are evocative in a very subtle way.
There is such a remoteness and otherworldliness, a silence in these pictures.
You become part of a dialogue with these works that is really profound, and it draws you in. People see not so much themselves, they see states of being, states of sensibility. That makes a very intimate relationship. Helene Schjerfbeck is one of the great outstanding painters of the late 19th and especially the 20th century, who probably a lot of people have not yet heard of, but who is a national icon, a celebrated painter in Finland and in Sweden.
Helene Schjerfbeck is the prize of Finland. She was born in 1862 in Helsinki and died in Stockholm in 1946. From the time she was 11 years old, she was recognized as a prodigy. Schjerfbeck started as a naturalist and then progressed to her own brand of modernism. She developed a style of painting all her own.
Seeing Silence, the Paintings of Helene Schjerfbeck, really is the first major show of Helene Schjerfbeck in the United States. This exhibition really introduces her to an American audience. It's also a fascinating story of an artist's journey, and it's a sensation to have these works here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum.
We had in mind not to do a retrospective of Schjerfbeck, but to condense the very finest masterpieces of her career into passages of her art, which actually track her life story as well. There's often a lot of mystery in her work. She is paring down her subjects to the simplest objects. Figures are not individualized. Her technique is also idiosyncratic and extraordinary. She adds and subtracts layers of paint. She has a limited palette, white, black, blue. Her figures never stare at her as she paints them, nor does she stare at them. The more spare they become, the more and more enigmatic they become. You get a clear understanding of her development and growth from the very first paintings until the very final spectral, searing late self-portraits. Schjerfbeck was on her own path. She was a very quiet, remote, introspective woman, and yet she had fierce determination against all odds to pursue her painting. It shaped her life. It was her life. The exhibition begins with Schjerfbeck's first full-scale paintings. These are paintings that she made actually in Finland. And this is a Finnish history painting. The subject is the death of a 16-year-old Count, William Schwerin. He died in what is known as the Finnish War between Sweden and Russia. It's a very touching, very humane painting, and so accomplished for an 18-year-old. It won a prize at the Finnish National Society annual exhibition, and she then won a stipend from the government to travel to Paris. She was conforming to an expectation to memorialize Finnish history, but it stands so far apart from her later work. In Paris, she was obviously responding to her teachers, but she's already working beautifully with light. In terms of portraiture, she is still individualizing her figure. But already here she's softening her strokes. She's adding color in areas that aren't necessarily descriptive, but that are aesthetically pleasing to her. And it has a lot of feeling, this painting. And it was painted in 1884 when she was 22. That is a remarkable fact that she was already so proficient at such a young age. She was already manipulating her language to, as she said, seek the truth. Schjerfbeck actually painted this in St. Ives, the picturesque coastal town in Cornwall, England. It was shown publicly in Helsinki on its completion, and it was damned by the press because they were looking for traditional landscape painting. It's very, very beautifully executed. If you look at the touches of color, she's reaching a level of abstraction already in 1883, presaging what is to come, of course, in later decades. In 1902, Schjerfbeck moved from Helsinki to a small railroad town, Hyvinkää, where she joined her widowed mother, essentially to look after her, which enabled Schjerfbeck to leave the distractions of Helsinki and paint full time. She was there with her mother until her mother died in 1923. To my mind, these figure paintings are among the most powerful and evocative of, as you said, a sensibility. She's continuing to hone her style and to render her language more and more spare.
And I think they also keep a certain distance from you as a viewer. You almost like approach them while they are still immersed in their own spiritual sphere. And I think that actually makes them also so accessible. You're part of, I would say, an emotional bond and a reflection that you have on yourself with it.
These are not portraits, these are figure paintings. And she's using light so beautifully, and that she does from her very early years, actually.
She used local sitters, but she was, of course, using her knowledge of art history and also applying her deep training in different techniques to create work that is quite connected with artistic developments, both of the time as well as of the past.
This painting, the Lace Shawl, dates to 1920 when Schjerfbeck was actually in a picturesque coastal village called Tamasari. The sitter is Sigrid Nyberg, who was her landlady in her boarding house. She typically recruited anyone from the community, wherever she was, to pose for her. It's a striking painting in and of itself, but it's also a very telling example of her idiosyncratic style developed at mid-career, where she would add and subtract paint layers from her canvas using a palette knife and stylus to actually remove paint, to the point where she was often actually exposing the weave of the canvas.
So this one is actually one of the most elaborate in regard to using different techniques. It is a work that depicts a sitter, but actually it depicts a modern woman. And I think that that's also important to see, that Helene Schjerfbeck as an artist was very versed in the development of the modern woman. I think she wanted to paint a certain prototype of a woman.
There's a certain power, actually, yes, I think, in her expression.
So the severity, or what we now see as a strong expression, that I think is very intentional and powerful. For us, of course, a great and important acquisition. And it is the very first painting of Helene Schjerfbeck in an American collection. For us, it was a great opportunity.
In this gallery, we deviate from chronology. Rather, I've decided to put the landscapes and paintings that sort of speak to each other in terms of her actual aesthetic. So we have some landscapes from Fiesole, the hill town outside Florence, a painting evocative of Renaissance pictures. And then on this wall, we have only 5 still lifes in the exhibition. She didn't paint still lifes to the extent that she did figure paintings, but this gives you a microcosm of the evolution of her aesthetic over time. From the very early French style, very beautifully brushed, very softly painted, very mainstream, I would say. But here we are marching forward in time to 1930, where she's using a very dry pigment, which you'll see in several of these paintings. She's outlining her pears with a very strongly delineated black line, and she's scraping away at her canvas. And here you have an entire passage of canvas that's been scraped down to the bone. This is from 1915. Here your eye really recognizes what she's doing with her paint, and she's creating this very energetic, textured surface here, where the objects sort of lose clarity, lose geometry, lose form. The painting is a sort of pulsating example of her use of bright color, which one rarely sees elsewhere in her work, and the growing abstraction of even a still life. She's as far removed from Paul Cézanne as you could be at this point. And here, this is a further example of the dissolution of form, the absence of geometry, and one is struck by this black apple, considered by some as metaphorical, given the fact it was painted in 1944 in the worst years of World War II. There's no volume to these apples. The shadow is just as prominent as the apple itself. They merge into one another. It's a fascinating abstraction as a simple still life image goes. In 1915, Schjerfbeck's dealer, Gösta Stenman, introduced a young forester called Einar Reuter. She fell in love with Einar. He was 18 years younger, and I think the love was a deep emotional attachment. Each had a great passion for art, and so they were intellectually and emotionally very much in tune with one another, and she just adored him. She wrote him hundreds and hundreds of letters in her lifetime. At a certain moment in time, he married and she had a nervous breakdown. She was devastated, so she clearly wished for more of him. And she painted several portraits of him. This one she amusingly titled The Sailor. He was no sailor, but it was painted in this coastal town, Tamasari, where they actually spent 2 weeks together painting one summer. It's a bit bizarre, but it has a sensuality to it. After he married, they continued to stay in touch with each other. She recovered and continued painting, and he eventually wrote her biography, published in Finnish, and she was raised in the Swedish language, so she couldn't actually read her biography. The book does, unfortunately, initiate a mythology of victimhood for this poor artist because she was a woman, because she had chronic depression. But instead of focusing on the frailty of a woman painter in remote Finland, I've wanted to build an exhibition that gives you the extraordinary qualities of an artist who's every bit as worthy as the male artists in Paris in the later 19th, early 20th century. I think she deserves her place in modernism. The exhibition is largely chronological until we reach this final gallery, when I thought we should completely surround the viewer with these extraordinary self-portraits. Schjerfbeck made 40 self-portraits in her lifetime, and a great many of them in the last 2 years of her life. The galleries are designed in such a way that the visitor gets a very clear understanding of her trajectory as an artist, actually, from the early years right until the last days.
This is, of course, one of the galleries that I think an audience will be stopped in their tracks, not only by the power of the portraits, but really by the artistic project that is behind it, right? The artistic project of self-examination, or this typology of a woman in time, aging. It's less self-portraits, it's actually states of being.
Especially in the last 2 years, where she's really painting mortality.
There's a brutal honesty that comes with it, and also you see works that she loses more and more any kind of details or specific markers of her own identity or depiction.
And they look really cadaverous.
Yes.
I mean, you could imagine them in a casket.
These are not easy paintings to live with.
Absolutely. But we're very lucky to have so many in the exhibition. She started at a very young age to interrogate her self-image. And I wanted very much to put them all together to give you that powerful punch at the end of the exhibition.
And it feels like that. And as a visitor, you immediately have reflections on your own life. You're not actually looking at someone else's life, you're looking at your own.
I hope the audience appreciates the fact that we're introducing an artist they've never seen before, and one clearly worthy of their attention. A woman who shied away from publicity and who cared little for advancing income. She was a woman of great courage, of great integrity. In a broader sense, Schjerfbeck reminds us that one should follow one's dreams. It's a chance to see a female modernist who, by dint of sheer determination and surviving generally on modest resources, found a way to paint all her life. It was really her lifeline.